Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webcast, The Power of Open Source. We have a great webinar planned for you today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This presentation will last about 30 minutes. Questions are welcome and encouraged. Please type any questions you have throughout the webinar into the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation when all of your questions will be answered. As a reminder, this webcast will be available on demand shortly after the webcast concludes. Please see the attachment section for a PDF version of the slides as well as some other helpful content. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ben Bromhead. Ben is our CTO and co-founder here at Instaclustr. Ben is responsible for working closely with his engineering team and customers to build highly available, scalable applications on top of Cassandra. Ben, I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Gina, for that introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone who's joined. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence. Today, really what I'd like to talk about is a little bit of the benefits of adopting an open source database, particularly or especially Apache Cassandra, and adopting Apache Cassandra with Instaclustr, and how that compares to some other options you might be looking at the moment, whether that might be a proprietary implementation or whether it might be a service that is provided by a particular web vendor. So I guess first of all, the question really to quickly cover, and we won't go into too much detail, is what is open source? So generally, the term open source, it refers to something that people can modify and share openly because the design is publicly accessible. So in the software world, that generally refers to the source code. So you're able to access that source code freely and compile it and run it the way that you see fit locally on your machine or on a public service or in production. There's always a number of different flavors of open source, and we won't get too much into it. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about here, we will be referring generally to the Apache license when we do. So that's kind of the flavor of the talk. Of course, open source licensing is an entire talk unto itself, so we won't really get too much down into the details there. But generally, it's about software that you can freely access, freely modify, and freely share because it is publicly available. So the benefits of open source, and there are actually quite a few, and we will spend a little bit of time on it. But four of the key benefits of open source, and this will apply really to any open source project that you're looking at, not just a data store such as Cassandra. But really, when it comes down to open source, it's all about choice. So by its very nature, the source code of open software is available to all, meaning that no company will generally own the software. There's a number of situations where the copyright or the IP might be dedicated or assigned to a legal organization that is there to protect and enforce the license and to ensure that it is done fairly in the open source world. But really, that is just a means of legal protection rather than any stake of ownership. And any company can build upon open source software. So it may be operated and maintained by multiple vendors. It may be maintained and operated by multiple operators or by hobbyists or by professionals. And really, it's about reducing both barriers to entry and exit from that software. So a customer can very easily choose either one vendor or they can choose one open source project, and you're not locked into a specific vendor's offering. The second characteristic that's quite important is open source software is generally peer reviewed, and it tends to be very highly peer reviewed. Take, for example, the infrastructure of the internet. It's largely composed of open source programs such as DNS, SendMail, Apache, Nginx, and now a lot of new languages based on Python, Ruby, Node.js. These are all proven to be fairly reliable and robust under the most strenuous conditions. A lot of these technologies power some very, like 90% of the world's websites. And they've really led to the very fast growth of the internet. Apache Cassandra is a very good example of this. And the fact that it is open source has seen it, I guess, the adoption of it be very widespread, be picked up by some very large companies. And of course, as those large companies pick it up and see that it solves a number of problems for them, they're starting to contribute back. So open source software is also often developed through community forums and collaboratives. Developers or companies volunteer their time and their expertise and their resources, and they tend to be coordinated within the experts and those experienced with the software. And what happens when it comes to reliability is you often have many eyes looking at that same piece of code. That code is available freely, open for review. All the companies that tend to run it, all the organizations, all the individuals, new releases, people can look at the changes. People can look at the modifications. You get assurance because there are a very large number of people looking at that. Whereas when you look at a proprietary solution, it tends to be a very limited subset of developers. Yes, it is their full-time job, but again, single features will tend to be worked on by one or two developers, and so just the sheer number of people that are looking at it is greatly reduced. Related to reliability, security is also another key component of open source software. And because open source software enables anyone to examine software for security vulnerabilities, it does have that aspect of continuous and broad peer review through this publicly available source code. It does tend to ensure that you will pick up more security vulnerabilities. And in fact, what you often see is that not only is the community associated with the project kind of casting a very fine-tooth comb, through the project, but you quite often see that security researchers, security companies will look to review open source software to find vulnerabilities there. One, because they don't need to engage and have a contract to do it with another company. It's great for their reputation. They do it as either part of university work or as part of professional or organizational reputational building. And so you just, not only have the community looking at it, but you have more professional eyes looking at it as well. The fourth component that is also very important is the whole idea of the time to market and how quickly you can actually deploy this software and actually use the open source components to get your vision of your business, get the vision of your application onto the market a lot quicker. And this really comes down to the fact that with open source software, you can rapidly evaluate multiple different options, and you can include it within whatever product or whatever service you're building with very little interaction with the third-party vendor, if not none. Generally, what it requires is that you would do the same level of research about whether it's a fit for the problem you're trying to solve as you would any project. You would have a look at what the broader market views that piece of software as, how what the reliability is like. But in terms of actually testing it and playing with it and starting to put it within your project, it's very easy, very simple to do, and you can often get up and running very quickly. So moving forward to that as well, and kind of breaking down some of those categories that I talked about before, is, going forward into them a little bit deeper, is this idea of crowd power as well. So the collective ideas and the thoughts delivered through, I guess what I'd call it is really the power of many, or the power of a very wide community. It'll tend to provide more eyes, more ideas, more focus, and because you've got a more diverse community working on it, you actually tend to see a more robust product. Of course, the other part of it, which is the cost effectiveness of open source, it has a very, very low adoption cost, so you don't have obviously any licensing fees or any adoption fees associated with that. Now, with any product that you adopt, you do take on that product and any associated technical debt with it. But that's something you've got to be aware of with any product, whether it be a proprietary one, whether it be an open source one, or whether it be a product that you adopt through, say, a third-party API. Right, so that's always something that you've got to pay for. You've also always got to become an expert in it, right? So the idea that you pay for open source software in time, I would actually say that you have to pay for most products in time. There may be some elements of open source whereby you do have to put a little bit more time in than you would with, say, other things, because you don't have that a vendor if you do it by yourself to rely on. But generally, any product certainly requires an investment in time. So the other thing as well is that a lot of this open source software is becoming the norm within many large enterprises. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of the internet is powered by open source software. I won't go through too many of this as well, because we did kind of touch on it before, but the last two are really important, which is what goes into a product. It is based on merit, right? We live in a world where there is no true meritocracy, and everyone's got their own opinions and agendas, but in an open source community, that is all laid bare for everyone to see. And each open source community does certainly strive to include the best ideas, really based on the merit of those and the usefulness of them. And you'll always see debate about it, and you'll always see some great backwards and forwards and debate around what's the best ideas, how that should be implemented. But again, that's all laid out in the open. It's all laid out, for anyone to have a look at, and it really does formulate or push the best ideas to the top. And of course, the community that builds around that, it really means that issues with, say, documentation or different supported environments very quickly get addressed as people have their own itches to scratch. And so you can certainly see support for environments where there might only be a few users for them, but if someone implements it, you get to benefit from that. And so you're not waiting for a vendor to say, hey, at least 20% of our customer base is now up for this. We can finally look at that, implementing that ourselves. So what are in terms of Apache Cassandra itself, right, and this is why we're here today, is to have a look at really the power of open source Cassandra. So at its core, Apache Cassandra, and I quite often use the term Apache or open source Cassandra interchangeably. Apache Cassandra, it is the distribution of Cassandra that is used by the leading companies in the world. This includes Apple, Instagram, Microsoft, AT&T, and Honeywell. So when you choose to run Apache Cassandra, you are using the same code base as what these companies are all using themselves. The largest, the highest performance Cassandra clusters in the world, these are all Apache Cassandra clusters, right? So this is the exact same code base. You get to take that, you get to deploy that into your organization. So you've got that same level of assurance that you're going to get the best possible experience. What we're also starting to see a little bit in the Apache Cassandra community, previously some of these operators would often end up running, say, slightly older, more stable versions and backporting certain new features But what we've started to see within the community as well is that they've all adopted a commitment, particularly with the upcoming 4.0 release, to run and test the 4.0 RC candidate and to ensure that as they move forward and as they work on these on Apache Cassandra, that they will be actually running a version, a release that everyone can consume as well. So we're going to start to see a huge increase in the reliability and the stability of brand new Apache Cassandra releases, which, you know, if you've been around the community for a little bit, you know, historically, brand new releases of Cassandra have you know, had a few extra bugs that probably shouldn't have been there, but we're really starting to see a great tightening up of you know, the testing and the performance implementations there. The other bit is that the Apache Cassandra community has a very vibrant community, you know, with large operators, as I just mentioned before, peacefully independent vendors like ourselves, but you also have some great groups in there. You see some companies building some great support for, I guess, related products around the Apache Cassandra project. You know, a few vendors that come to mind are like DataStax.io, The Last Pickle, and so you really see a very vibrant community around Apache Cassandra. The third component is that the majority of Apache Cassandra developers, particularly nowadays, are the ones that run Apache Cassandra in production, right? So you no longer have a large vendor that doesn't run this stuff in production, kind of committing code that is purely based on, you know, their release cycle that they've got to drive, their product roadmap. What we're actually seeing is quite a good bit of stability returning to the project now that we just have purely operators actually driving it and running it and making sure that the code they commit has actually been deployed and run in production, that has actually been run across, you know, clusters that have thousands of nodes in them. So what about the actual benefits of running Apache Cassandra with us, with Instaclustr? So the way that we deploy Cassandra at Instaclustr is we take just Apache Cassandra and we don't do anything to it. We want to ensure that you use the open source version. That's the version that we believe is the best. If we want to add any features to Apache Cassandra, or we find bugs, or we need to patch it, or we need to do something, 100% of what we do there, it goes back into the open source community, right? So everything we do here, we believe it belongs back in the community. We believe you should have the ability to run it locally, to run it on a different environment that we don't support, to run it in a private data center, or even to run it by yourself in an environment we do support if you don't want to work with us, right? That's 100% fine, and we believe we get a far bigger benefit from working within the community than without it. And some of the benefits that you get by running Apache Cassandra with Instaclustr, that might be a little bit difficult to build yourself, or that you might need some additional help with, is this idea of the first one. This is a cool feature that we just released recently, is dynamic scalability. So with Instaclustr, you can now scale Cassandra to cope with momentary increases in workloads in minutes rather than hours. So traditionally with Apache Cassandra, when you add capacity, it takes a while to restream data, reshuffle things. What we've done is we've actually made some use of some features within Apache Cassandra to actually make it a lot easier to dynamically scale this up and down. And we do that without any topology or token range changes. And it's really about leveraging our expertise with AWS and Apache Cassandra and making sure that they work really smoothly together. So this capacity or this capability is actually built into Apache Cassandra today. You could go out and build it yourself if you wanted to and orchestrate it, but we make this very easy to do with Instaclustr, and we make it very tuned and very optimized. The second point that you know, is really important when adopting open source software is this idea of 24/7 support and expertise. That's one of the things that is quite often missing when you go to adopt an open source project for the first time in your organization, and this is quite often where people look to vendors or proprietary solutions, is not only do they get the code, the bits, the instructions that run it on a computer, but they also need the support and the background and the expertise here. And so what you get with Instaclustr is you get 100% of the benefits of open source. You get that pure choice. You don't have that vendor lock-in, but you also get a proven support provider who's done this over thousands and thousands of nodes, hundreds of clusters, with an expert team. Right? This leads your adoption of Apache Cassandra to, I guess, the risk associated with adopting it is dramatically reduced. So because we run and manage Apache Cassandra versions and patches for you, we do all the testing, we ensure that you're running the most stable version, you actually get some great assurance that you're in really good hands. And on top of that as well is we reduce the risk of having to hire and build the expertise internally within your organization. So you don't have to manage that HR risk that, you're one Cassandra expert, walk out the door, with a much better offer there. And of course, even though we do take that role of providing support and expertise within your organization, there is still a great amount of knowledge transfer that does go on. So, should in the future you want to, head a different direction, that's very easy to do. There's no proprietary or vendor lock-in here. And it's very simple for you to choose the right direction that makes sense for your company. So what does Apache Cassandra with Instaclustr look like if you, say, compare it to a proprietary implementation of Cassandra? So with Instaclustr, it is fully managed. So you get a operations team alongside your database. If you are going to go down the DataStax Enterprise path, you still have to hire an expert Cassandra team to operate this, right? So with Instaclustr, it is fully managed. We do the operations for you, and we provide support on top of that as well. One of the really interesting and key things, and one of the things I love about our support offering, is it's not just break fix, right? So it's not just, hey, I saw this exception in my logs, or hey, your product isn't working as expected. One of the things that everyone gets with our support is you do get a certain number of just included professional services hours. So you can reach out to our support team and you can say, hey, I'm thinking about adding this new feature and we're thinking about this particular table structure, and what do you think about the composition of my primary key? Can we get feedback? How does that look for hotspots? What compaction strategy can I use? So you get to really leverage our expertise there, and that ensures that you have the best possible experience and you get your implementation right the first time. The second component is that Instaclustr, running Apache Cassandra with Instaclustr, you get a set of experienced operators. We've been running and managing Apache Cassandra for many, many years. We have great operational experience across thousands of nodes, hundreds of clusters. DataStax at the end of the day is a software vendor that hasn't actually run this stuff in production. It has no organizational experience running Cassandra. Look, they've got a great couple of individuals that have done this stuff at other companies, but as an organization, they don't have the organizational expertise to really do this and to do this well. The third component is security. So Instaclustr provides and implements not only enterprise-grade security within Apache Cassandra, so that comes down to encryption and protection for data at rest, data in transit, great access controls, great audit history and trails. But it's all well and good for an IT product to have those controls in place, but at the end of the day, you've still got to implement and run this data store in an environment, and you've got to run it in a secure way. And security is just much broader than the product's controls itself. It comes down a lot to the organizational controls itself. We've spent a lot of time, effort, and money on ensuring that we provide the best organizational security, the best procedural security, the best network security that we can around Apache Cassandra as a deployed product. And we're not just claiming that, we're going through a third party, we've gone through third-party verification and compliance audits. We've just recently achieved SOC 2 compliance. We're in the process of doing that with PCI. We also have the capability as well to enable your HIPAA compliance as well, right? So we have a very, I guess, laser focus when it comes to security, but it's also about being able to independently demonstrate and prove that by third-party audits and by compliance, right? The fourth component that you really get with us that you won't get with any other third-party proprietary vendor, whether it be in the Apache Cassandra space, whether it be in a different database space, whether it be in a cloud provider, is that you're fully portable when it comes to running Cassandra with Instaclustr. We don't believe in vendor or technical lock-in, so we run 100% Apache Cassandra. If you want to, it means that it's very easy to come on board to our service, right? So if you're already running Apache Cassandra yourself, it makes the migration very, very easy. It's just simply a matter of setting Instaclustr up as a second data center. We can restream, we can repeer everything, set it up, get it all synced up and repaired, and then you can start using a cluster managed by us. But it works in the reverse as well. If you need to leave for whatever reason, if you want to do it yourself, if you want to look somewhere else, that's 100% fine, and that's why we choose open source Cassandra, is we believe it gives you this benefits and this portability. And at the end of the day, we want to provide the best possible experience, and we're not going to know whether we're doing that if you're locked in for any other reason, right? So that's why we firmly believe in running 100% Apache Cassandra and giving you that freedom and that portability should your business, decide to change tack. What about Apache Cassandra with Instaclustr versus, say, a public cloud provider's own managed database services? One that we often talk about is DynamoDB. So again, what I would say, and this claim kind of surprises a number of people, is despite its marketing claims, DynamoDB still actually requires active management and expertise to run effectively. They've certainly improved things over the past, but you do need someone who is skilled in DynamoDB, who knows how to run it, and you do still have someone that is going to get paged when you have issues with DynamoDB, right? If you start to exceed quotas, or if you start to see timeouts or excess latency, you've got to have someone who gets paged, right? Your AWS is not going to look into that for you, even if you have AWS Enterprise support, which, by the way, requires a minimum spend of $15K a month or a 10% increase in your total cloud fees. AWS support stuff, they can't look at individual partitions for you. They can't look at queries. They can't do that optimization. You still need someone who's an expert in DynamoDB to really run through that with you, right? And a great example, or the best way I've heard someone kind of talk about it, is that AWS, it's a Ferrari in pieces, right? You've still got to have someone that knows how to build it, who knows how to assemble it, who knows how to service it, who knows how to maintain it, right? With Instaclustr, we at least take responsibility for the engine. You get a fully assembled engine. We take responsibility for assembling and maintaining it, ensuring it's running nice and tuned. The second thing to keep in mind when it comes to looking at third-party, cloud provider or public cloud provider data stores is they tend to be quite expensive, particularly when you compare it to Apache Cassandra. Apache Cassandra provides far better economics for high throughput, low latency reads and write operations. I won't get too much into this, but I would definitely, invite anyone to, run a few benchmarks against either Apache Cassandra locally or with us, and then just to do a bit of, back of the napkin math when it comes to DynamoDB and, see what a similar level of cost is there. The third and probably one of the most important components here is that Apache Cassandra from day one has been built with true multi-region support. It has support for multiple data centers, multiple regions, and it's done as a first-class citizen. So you as a developer, you can control the consistency and the latency of your operations and how they interact with your different data centers. Whereas if you look at that compared to DynamoDB, excuse me, DynamoDB's multi-region capability is done with kind of a tacked-on streaming capability as well. So you don't really get to control the consistency between multiple regions there. And it also includes, it adds additional cost to the, your DynamoDB deployment. So really it comes down to, avoiding a number of pitfalls when it comes to proprietary lock-in. With cloud-specific lock-in, adopting all the cloud provider-specific APIs and data stores, it certainly makes migration and leveraging competitive pricing in the future a bit of an issue further down the line, right? So, look, you are going to have to adopt some level of cloud vendor-specific APIs, whether that's, for instance, provisioning, network control, and setup. But the more or the further up the stack you go when it comes to adopting specific cloud provider APIs, is it makes it very difficult for you to leave that cloud provider or to leverage a multi-cloud setup further down the line. And when it comes to leveraging multi-cloud environments, is quite often people are like, well, hey, look, we're only just getting into a single cloud provider. We're only just moving out some of our workloads to the public cloud. And so it can be a little bit challenging to think about a multi-cloud strategy, but if you are really looking to build a highly resilient, highly scalable application or service that is backed or runs on a public cloud, you've also got to look at the idea of systemic resilience, right? And what that is about is that, look, you can be in multiple regions, multiple availability zones, but at the end of the day, they're all run by the same software. All the control planes, they all run the same software, so they're all susceptible to, the same bugs, right? And a great example of this is, I think it was Microsoft Azure. I think it was coming up to about a year and a bit ago. They had a storage bug that was actually impacting multiple geographies, multiple regions, right? So, look, they are rare events, but they do happen, right? And so Microsoft Azure customers who had adopted a multi-region strategy, thinking that they were following best practices, they were still hit by downtime, right? And so by avoiding cloud lock-in, you can start to pursue multi-cloud vendor deployments, and you can really start to build some systemic resilience in that. When it comes to avoiding vendor lock-in, again, you don't want to be looking to bring another Oracle in sheep's clothing into your organization, right? You really want to be sticking with open source software. And this applies not just to Apache Cassandra, but applies to a lot of things. And as soon as you start to adopt a vendor's proprietary implementation, you start to use the additional things that lock you in, that no longer become compatible with the open source version. And as soon as you do that, you're really held hostage to ongoing pricing increases. And there's nothing worse than having to rewrite key components of your application due to contract or vendor management issues, right? If there's nothing wrong with the actual implementation, but you're just being held hostage by pricing, that's work you don't have to do. That's work you shouldn't have to do. And by adopting open source, you can ensure you're never held hostage when it comes to pricing. On top of that, you don't have the option of, running specific, modifications or code specific to your code base, or actually looking through it and thinking, hey, we'd like it to behave a little bit differently. Right? So you've got no option to do that. The best you've got is to say, hey, we'd like this feature, and your vendor may or may not implement that. On top of that as well, vendors typically have longer time to discovery and far longer time to resolution for bugs and issues, whereas within the open source community, you see those bug reports get released pretty quickly and patches released again very quickly when it comes down to those kind of things. So that is a very, very quick tour of, I guess, why we believe open source or Apache Cassandra is the best implementation, the best distribution of Apache Cassandra. We think that just from an organizational risk perspective, from a adoption perspective, it really comes down to making the best decision for your company, and 9 times out of 10 open source is going to be the best bet. And certainly when it's backed by a vendor like Instaclustr, where you do get 100% of the benefits with open source, but you do also get that assurance and that support and that expertise, you're going to have one of the best experiences with that. So what I might do is I'll stop here and I'll open up any questions to the audience. We haven't received any questions during the presentation itself. So what I might do is I'll pause, give 20 or 30 seconds for anyone to start piping up with some questions. Otherwise, we're happy to end the webinar now. Great. All right. Well, if anyone, of course, has any questions that you maybe wanted to address or ask us directly outside of the webinar session, please feel free to email info@instaclustr.com. You can reach out directly to me at ben@instaclustr.com. But I wanted to thank you all very much for attending. I hope this has been informative. And of course, any inquiries or questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for attending.